Good evening, everybody. Then, thank you, Aaron, for asking me to speak. It's nice to be a part of this program. I think when I was asked to speak, I was a bit wary because afterwards I was wary because I saw the other four speakers were all either Rabbonim or Dayanim, and then there was me, so I wasn't really in the same level of other people, but maybe part of Sukkot, as I'll try to say today, is about sort of, my subject is Ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asura. You've sort of got to go in, you've got to be proactive, you've got to do things. So even if you're a poshut yid like myself, maybe I've got something I can say and one or two people can learn a few things from. So,
sorry, Adam, just before you kick off, I'll just remind everyone I've just reposted the source sheet in the chat if anyone hasn't got it yet.
Okay. Thank you, Alan, for that. And as I go along, if people have got any questions, you can either unmute yourself and chat or post it in the chat. Also, Alan, please remind me if there are lots of questions coming up. You can stop me at some point and I'll see if I can answer them, or you can help out, or Rafi, who's helped me a bit with some of the sources, my son, he can also help out as well. So if you've got the source sheet, if you haven't, I'll kick off anyway. I'm starting off with a Mishnah in Sukkot. This actually is part of the first Mishnah in Sukkot, although in the case of the Gemara, it's split, so that actually appears on Daf Tet. And it talks about a Sukkah Yeshana, an old Sukkah. Beit Shammai poslim and Beit Hillel machshirin. Beit Shammai says it's possum, you can't use it. Beit Hillel says it's kosher. And then they ask the question, Ve'ezo hi Sukkah Yeshana, what is an old sukkah? Anytime you make it before the Chag, which is always a reference to Sukkot, more than 30 days. If it's more than 30 days before Sukkot, it's called an old sukkah. If you made it for the purposes of Sukkot, for the purposes of the Chag, even from the beginning of the year, it's kosher. So you've got here, just to explain it, an argument between the Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Essentially, what Beit Shammai, and the best way of explaining it, actually, I'm going to go straight to Rashi, which explains why does Beit Shammai say an old sukkah, a sukkah which was made more than 30 days before Sukkot. Why is that not kosher? And why does Beit Hillel say it is kosher? So if you look at source number 2, Rashi explains, Beit Shammai poslim, Beit Shammai says it's not kosher. The ba'u sukkah lishma, because you need sukkah lishma for its sake. In other words, for the sake of the Chag. You have to make sukkah deliberately for the Chag, for Sukkot, for sukkah you're going to live in on Sukkot. V'zu stam naset, and he has only just made this without any intention. Ve'ilu toch shloshim l'chag hava. However, if it was done within 30 days of Sukkot, since you ask, which really says you learn about the laws of Sukkot from 30 days before Sukkot, there's an assumption that if you make any sukkah within 30 days of the Sukkot, you're clearly making it for Sukkot, for the purpose of your sukkah, for your mitzvah of sukkah on Sukkot. Aval kodem shloshim stam alav lachag. But before 30 days, you haven't made it for Sukkot. That's the assumption. So you're making, most people, we make it just after Yom Kippur. Or this year, probably the day beforehand in the way it worked out. But the assumption is that if you make it within 30 days of Sukkot, you're definitely, according to Beit Shammai, you're making it for Sukkot. If it's before 30 days, you're not making it for Sukkot. However, Beit Hillel Makshim, he says, even if you make a sukkah from well beforehand, for more than 30 days before Sukkot, that is kosher. Why? You don't need to make a sukkah for the purposes of the Chag, for Sukkot. He says, what does that mean? He would hold that you can make sukkah l'shem sel, for the purpose of shade. As long as you've intended to make a sukkah for shade purposes, and imagine you're in Israel, you decide in August, I'm going to build a sukkah because I need a bit of shade here from the sun. That would be perfectly acceptable according to the opinion, the pure opinion of Rashi here in the Gemara, and to use that sukkah for Sukkot. You don't need to say at that point in time, I'm making this for my sukkah to use and in Sukkot. You could just make it for shade in the summer, and then afterwards you can use it for Sukkot. Okay, so we're going to expand it a bit in the Gemara, what I've just said. So it's the why there are the two different opinions. Why does Beit Shammai say you have to make it for a sukkah, specifically for the mitzvah of the sukkah for Sukkot? And why does Beit Hillel say, no, you just have to make it for shade purposes? So source number 4, Elamai time mehu de Beit Shammai. What's the reason of Beit Shammai? Kutiv K'Achavina, there's another pasuk, because actually this is a continuation of an earlier Gemara, but this is the verse that they use. Haka Sukkot, ignore there's a typo there. It should say Haka Sukkot taseh lecha shivat yamim. You should make the Haka Sukkot, you should make for yourself for 7 days. So Sukkah ha'asuya l'shem chag ba'inon. He interprets that verse to mean you have to make a sukkah for the purpose, we need it for the purpose of the Chag. It says sukkah for the Chag, basically. You turn the words round. However, Beit Hillel interprets the verse differently. He says, Beit Hillel, he's learned from this verse that you make a sukkah on Chol HaMoed. Because it says you should make a sukkah 7 days, it means any time in the 7 days you can make a sukkah. So if your sukkah blew down on the first 2 days of Sukkot and you came to day 3, you would have to go and build it again and live in the sukkah. And that's the interpretation. And I think that's how that's actually how we paskin. You do have to do that in such a situation. And how does Beit Hillel? Beit Hillel but Beit Hillel holds that actually you don't make a sukkah on Chol HaMoed. Beit Shammai says. Okay. So basically, we've got the different ways of interpreting the verse, but essentially the argument, to reiterate again, is the fact that Beit Hillel says you just can make a sukkah for shade purposes, and that's perfectly acceptable. So as I said, it is when you make it in August, you want a shade from the sun, you can continue to use that sukkah. However, Beit Shammai says you have to make sukkah for Sukkot, for the purpose of the Chag. Now, interesting, although we follow Beit Hillel, we don't quite follow Beit Hillel, because if you see source 5, there is a qualification on the view of Beit Hillel in the Shulchan Aruch. And it says here in the second line after the introduction, Sukkah Yeshana, Dahaina She'asa Kodem, She'yikansu Shloshim Yom She'livnei HaHag Kasheva. An old sukkah, which is made more than 30 days before Yom Tov, is kosher. Ubilvad, so that's following Beit Hillel. Ubelvad sheyachadesh ba dava ata begufa l'shem chag. As long as you renew, do put something new in it for the purpose of the Chag. So you can't, if you would have made your sukkah in the summer for shade in Israel, you would have to go along and still do something new. A very little bit, according to the halakha. It says here, "V'tefach al tefach sagi imhu b'makom echad." It's only an area of a tefach by a tefach, what's that, about 3 or 4 inches square. You would have to sort of re-put on that bit of sahach, according to this opinion, or you could do a very narrow line across the whole sukkah. So you do need to do something new, which actually follows the view of the Yerushalmi there. So basically, we follow Beit Hillel. You just need a sukkah for shade, but still you should do something new for Sukkot. Okay, so that's sort of stage 1. Is everyone clear this stage? I can stop for any questions. It gets a bit more complicated now. All okay. Nothing in the chat. Good. Okay. So we're now going to start the discussion, which is the main purpose of the shir, of what's called Ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. You have to make a sukkah, and actually thank you, Owen, again for posting the sources on the chat if anyone wants to print off the sources or look at them. So that's the subject, as I said, is you have to make a sukkah. It can't happen automatically. Lo min ha'asui. It can't happen, and we'll see this when we look at specific examples. And for the purpose of this shir, I'm going to focus on 3 separate mishnayot in sukkah. I'll come back to those questions just because I'm in a flow now, and I'll look at that after the next bit if I can. So I'm going to focus on 3 different Mishnah in Sukkah and understand the slight difference between this idea of making a Sukkah along min ha'asuri. And it's interesting to see the differences between these 3 Mishnah, and I'll look at some of the Gemara on it. So the first one, people will be very familiar with some of these. You've looked with those who've got children, they may have seen the nice Sukkah books growing up with the nice pictures in them. And we've certainly got on our Sukkah wall, one of my nicest posters is the one which has got the pictures of all the Mishnah of Sukkah. And of course, one of the famous pictures is the one indeed, Chachotet begodish la'asot lo Sukkah eina Sukkah. So if one who hollows out a haystack to make for it a Sukkah, that is not a Sukkah. So we're talking about a scenario here where you've got a bundle, a stack of just a haystack, so like a box. Imagine it's a sort of box of haystack. It's just a complete solid block, I should say. And you dig into the haystack. Again, you'll be familiar with this from some of those pictures. And by digging into the haystack, this haystack is a minimum size, which is kosher for Sukkah. So it's a 7 by 7 tefachim, which is not that much. So, 2 feet by 2 feet, let's say, for the sake of argument, and you dig into it, by digging into it, you create an area of 10 tefachim high, which is the minimum height of a sukkah. You have then seemingly got a kosher sukkah, but the Mishnah says no, it's not kosher, and the reason it's not kosher is because of this principle of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asur. You have to make a sukkah, and it can't happen automatically. And when it says you have to make it, the important point is you have to make the sahach. So when it says sukkah, read sahach. You have to be involved in making the sahach of the sukkah. That's the key point here. Okay, I can't emphasize that enough. You have to make the sahach, and here you've had no involvement in making the sahach. All you have done is dug into the haystack, and you've effectively created the sukkah automatically. And I suppose the point is the layer of, when we started off with this haystack, this was kosher, so it didn't fall under the foul of the material being incorrect. The material was all very good. It was all straw, which you can use for your sukkah. The problem was the top layer of the straw was not a covering. It wasn't sahach. It wasn't covering anything. It was a solid block. And therefore, by you digging into it, you haven't been involved in making the sahach, okay, making the cover. And of course, you have to be involved in making that sahach, making it for shade purposes, and this is happened automatically. Okay, so that's Mishnah 1. Mishnah 2 is, if you turn over the page to source 7, slightly different. We're going to push it a bit further. I think each one's going to push the case a bit further. Is chavile kash v'chavile eitim v'chavile zavodim. So these are bundles of straw, wood, and some sort of cane. Ein masachin bahem. You can't use them for sachach. Okay, we'll explain why in a minute. But if you untied them, they would be okay to use. But kulan k'shevla defanot, and this kulan actually doesn't refer just to this particular Mishnah. It refers to all the Mishnahs that have happened so far in Sukkah, all the things which we've so far have learned. You haven't learned, but you may have learned in the past. But anything which is possible seemingly to use for sahach is perfectly okay to use for walls. So whether that's things tied to the ground, whether it's things that are makabel tumah, whether it's whether it's brick and metal, anything you can use for walls. Okay, so that's again an important point that we're really focusing when we're talking about making the sukkah. The key part is the sahach. Okay, so now let's look at the Gemara. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yaakov Shmei Minei Rabbi Yochanan Tati. I learned 2 things from Rabbi Yochanan. Chadaha, one was this thing which we learned above about the bundles of straw. And the other one was the other Mishnah, where you hollow out the haystack to make a sukkah, which isn't a sukkah. Chada mashum gezeirat otzer. One of these things, you can't use it because it is a decree of storehouses or storage we'll end up talking about. One of these two things you can't do because of Taser V'lo Min Ha'asui. Okay. So one of these missioners, that both of these things are he agrees are not allowed, but one is for one reason and one is for a different reason. But we'll see actually what I'm going to focus on is I'm going to talk about an example of bundles of straw, which will also be Taser V'lo Min Ha'asui. So, but I'll explain in a minute. Go on in the Gemara. I don't know which is which. Which one was a problem because of Otzer? Which one was a problem because of Taser V'lo Min Ha'asui? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah nechzei anon. Let's see if we can work this out. Amar Rabbi Chia ba'aba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, mibnei ma amu chavili kash v'chavili eitzim v'chavili zvadim ein mesachachin bahen. Why can't we use these bundles of straw, wood, etc., for your sahach? Why? Parmim. Now this is the important sort of part of the story. Parmim she'adam ba min hasadeh be'erev. Sometimes a person comes back from the field in the evening. And he has his bundle on his shoulder and he's feeling very tired. He takes it up and he puts it down on his hut. He's got his like sukkah there without anything on top of it. So he has a good sahar and he decides, I'm very tired. I've got to rest now. This is a good height. I'll put my bundle of haystack down on top of it. Kedela Yavsha. Not just because he's tired, he also wants to dry it out. So for whatever reason, it could be he wants to dry it out. It could be because he's very tired, etc. V'nimlach aleha l'sitr. Then he changes his mind and wants to use it for sahach. V'hatorah amra. So his intention when he put it up on top of the sukkah was only to use it to basically to dry it off. It had not for shade. Remember, it only has to be used for shade. If he wanted to put it up there for shade, happy days. He doesn't want to put it for shade. He wants to put it to dry. And then he changes his mind and says, "Now I want to use it for sahach, which could be for shade or for the actual chag of sukkah. Doesn't matter." And the Torah says, "Taser v'lo min ha'asui." Torah says you've got to make your sukkah, and it can't happen automatically. And now that wasn't actually the case that the Mishnah was referring to. The Mishnah sounds the case, but the Mishnah was actually referring to the Mishnah was referring to a very similar case where you actually, though, decided to put the bundles on top of your sukkah because you actually wanted it there for shade purposes. But even then, the rabbis went along and said, there's a gezerah, we don't allow that because of the situation where you decided, I just wanted to put it there for drying purposes. So actually the gezerah goes on the Mishnah case, but for the purposes of this shir and this discussion, the important point is the point I made is that if you decided to put the bundle on there for the purposes of drying, for no purposes of shade, and you change your mind and you decide I want it there for shade, that would not be a kosher sukkah. It would be a problem of Taser V'lo Min Ha'asui. And Gemara says in the other case is also of the Chotek Kodesh is also both. So we've now got two different cases. We've got the digging up the haystack, hollowing it up, where basically it's a problem of Taser V'lo Min Ha'asui. And then you've got a second case here of resting your haystack on top of the sukkah. Now, interesting, this in a sense is taking the story a bit further, because here you've certainly done an action here. You've taken your haystack and you put it on top of your sukkah. So you've done a maaser. However, this is not considered a maaser to do with a sarach, because what was the reason you put it there? You put it there for the purposes of just drying your bundle. You put it there because you wanted to dry your bundle. You didn't want it there for your sahach. And by you just changing your mind, this change of machshava of yours, that's not any action. There's no action involved. You just change your mind, saying, now I no longer want this just to be there for drying purposes. I want to turn this into for shade purposes. There's no action involved there. And the Torah says ta'aseh v'lo manaseh. You have to do action. When you put your sachach up, you have to have in mind, I want this for shade purposes. And as the person who put it up did not want it for shade purposes, it's clearly a case of ta'aseh v'lo manaseh. I'll pause for any questions. They're the first two cases. Anyone got questions or not? Hello, Cyril, by the way, lovely to see you. Okay, good. Let me carry on then, which is source number 8. This is our third Mishnah. So this is the third case of ta'aseh v'lo manaseh. Okay. My son reminded me I should look in the chat to see if there's any questions. So sorry, there are a few questions in the chat. Does it have to be, someone asked, does it have to be a structural change or can it just be a new decoration? I think when you say you have to mahadesh something, I think that was the first part of the shir, you have to do something to do with the sahach. So you can't just put a bit of decoration up. You've got to put something new in the context of the sahach itself. Okay, I think that's the only thing, which is really, everything else is the source sheets. Okay, so source number 8 is the next Mishnah. So it says, Hidla aleha to get and kissos. If you drape onto the sukkah your vine, your pumpkin, or your ivy, and this is something which is connected to the ground, and you just drape it onto the sukkah, Mesicha al gaba, and then you put sahach on top of it, pasula, the whole thing's possible. So you had kosher sahach and this non-kosher sahach because it's connected to the ground. However, if the kosher sachach was the majority, was more than the non-kosher bit, which was connected, it would be okay because there's a principle of bittul barov. It's the minority is nullified in the majority. Or shekatzasan kashera. Or if you cut down the bit which is connected, it's also kosher. And we're going to discuss this obviously in a bit more detail, this cutting down, because this is going to link up to our third issue of ta'aseh v'lo manaseh. Ze'akal, this is the general rule. Kol shehu makabel tumah, anything which is makabel tumah, which is things like, which are objects, like this is things like you can't use a chair or a table as your sachach, even if it's made of wood. And it doesn't grow, or it doesn't grow from the ground, you can't use it for sahach, so you can't use metal and things like that. But you have to use something which doesn't makabel tumah, isn't like an object, and it grows from the ground. Okay. Yativ Rav Yosef Kamei de Rav Huna, Yativ Ka'ama, Osha Katzasan Kasheva. So Rav Yosef said the following. What does this mean? This if you cut it down, it's kosher. On this point, Rav said you need to shake it. So the cutting down itself isn't enough. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to miss a little bit out, but there's a bit of a discussion in the Gemara who says what. And the conclusion is that that Rav actually ends up saying that it's basically you don't need to do anything else. The cutting down of the plants themselves is enough of an action. So just by you cutting down your plants, that's achshurei machsha. It says at the end, that makes it perfectly kosher. However, Shmuel says what it sounded like Rav said originally. Shmuel actually goes along and he says you actually don't need to just cut them down. You have to then shake them up and down, which you're familiar with probably. So you've got a machloket between Rav and Shmuel in the end. Rav says simply, you don't need to do anything else other than cutting them down because you can't have anything which is connected to the ground. Shmuel said you have to cut them down, and on top of that, you also have to shake them about, the sahach. And what's the rationale for both? If we look at source number 9, which is sort of Rav's original opinion, which ends up being Shmuel. So don't worry about the name so much, it's the more the principles. But Yativ Rav Yosef Kama Hachi Hatasana Shakatsasan Kashema Amar Rav Allah Nehi De Ein Sarich Lachzor L'Satwa Kula. Even the opinion, you don't need to sort of uproot the whole of it. Aval Sariku L'Naner Katsat. You need to shake it up a little bit. Those which were on the sahach, which were connected after they've been cut off. because that is considered enough of an action. Okay. Because if not, it's the problem of taser v'lo min asui. By you cutting down these branches, which were connected to the ground, you have effectively done an issue of taser v'lo min asui. Why? The hachi mashma sukkot taser. You have to make a sukkot. Very interesting words here. Kisha oseh ota tehei ru'uya l'sukkah. When you make it with something which is basically, when you make it, it has to be fitting for the sukkah. The thing you use to make it has to be fitting for the sukkah. V'lo min ha'asui b'posel she'eina ru'i l'sukkah. You can't make it with something which is posel, which is not fitting for the sukkah. So let me just expand on this a bit. So what we're saying here is these things which are connected to the ground, they are posel for the sukkah. The Mishnah says anything which is mechuba is posel. You can't use that for the sukkah. So Rashi is explaining that before you make your sahach, you can only make your sahach with something which is kosher to use as sahach. Okay, these things were not kosher to use as sahach. By you cutting them down, you've used something which was not kosher. And therefore, you have to go along. He says, you have to go in and do a little bit of a fixing of it. Key high like this. That when you make it kosher with a cutting, you don't need to uproot the whole thing. By you shaking them up and down, by moving a few of the branches up and down, that is equivalent to or close to uprooting it and sort of starting again. And he says that you can do that for each single one. So that's the opinion, which ends up being the opinion of Shmuel. However, the final opinion of Rav in source 10 is slightly different. So why does he say you don't need to do the nanua at all, the shaking up and down? He says, Achshure machsha. Why is that? Below nanua. The kasava kitsitsato zohi gama asiyato. He holds that the actual cutting, this is the completion of the doing. He says that the cutting is an asiyah. The cutting which you've done of the branches, that's enough of an action. You've been involved. It's not like the case of Chodei Begodish, where you weren't involved at all with the sukkah, in a sense, the sahach. It's not even like the other case the case of the Chavile Kash, where when you put it on, your thoughts were completely elsewhere. Here you've done an action. You've intended to put this up as sahach. So you can see there is a sort of an asiyah going on here. However, and therefore, he would say this is perfectly acceptable. And therefore, he goes on to say you can't compare it to Chodei Begodish, etc., etc. So you see here, you've got an argument between Rav and Shmuel that according to Rashi anyway, they are arguing, they both hold by the principle of taser v'lo min asui. You have to be actively involved in making the sahach. It can't happen automatically. Where their argument is, what is an asiyah? What is an action? According to Shmuel, the kasitza is not enough of an action because potentially, according to Rashi, it's an illegal action because you have to do an action with something which was kosher to use for sahach. So you have to do the shaking as well. According to Shmuel, no, even the cutting down itself is enough of a cutting. And I'll take a slight tangent here, but there's a sort of a similar argument. The principle, because if I'll get onto this later, but the argument of taser v'lo min asui doesn't come up just in the world of sukkah. It comes up in the world of tzitzit as well, for example, and in other things like mezuzah. That when you build, it says dilim taser lecha. You have to make threads for tzitzit. So if you had a situation with a tzitzit, for example, where you had let's say you had a three-cornered garment, which had tzitzit on each of the three corners. And then you decided that you had a fourth corner, which you were going to sew onto it, which already had the tzitzit attached to the fourth corner. And you sewed it onto that fourth corner. Okay. That would be a problem at taser v'lo min asui. Not with the fourth corner you put on, that was okay. But the first three, it wasn't chayav in tzitzit at that point in time. So this idea of taser v'lo min asui applies across different things. I mentioned briefly another example with mezuzah. So if, for example, you took your door off off, which actually my wife often does, but that's an aside. But if you take your door off the hinge and things, and even so maybe the bit where you put your mezuzah off, and you decided to, and then you fix your mezuzah to the doorpost, so to speak, which was sort of sitting on the floor, and then you decided to put that back up onto the doorpost, that would be again an issue of Taseh V'lo Asuri. You can only do it once you've got your door frame in place. So this idea of Taseh V'lo Asuri is interesting. It doesn't just come from Sukkot, it comes up in other laws like Tzitzit and Mezuzah. But for the purpose of what we've said so far, we've seen 3 different Mishnayot which discuss the idea of Taseh V'lo Asuri, and I've sort of built on it from the first one of the haystack to the second one of the bundles to the third one of cutting off the branches. Any questions? Okay, so we're now going to move it towards halacha now, in a sense, and we'll also pick up 1 or 2 other ideas. So we're looking now at source 11 on the 3rd sheet. No, that's fine. Checking there was nothing in the chat. Okay, so source 11, and this is discussing these cutting branches, which we spoke about. Who do we follow? Do we follow Rav or Shmuel? What you have to do, as you probably remember, the halacha says, "Im katzasa ilan hachshira." If you cut down the tree to make it kosher, you basically want to use your branches you've cut down as your sahach. You have to go and shake them. So this is a law. You're perfectly okay if you've got an overhanging tree. You could cut down those branches, put them on, just use that for your sahach, but you can't just do that alone. You have to then shake them about. So you have to lift everyone up and put it down. In fact, the mag you have to lift and put down, speak to your local Orthodox rabbi about, but you certainly have to do some sort of shaking. Because if it's not the case, the halacha says it would be a problem of, in the second line, Taseh V'lo Asuri. Okay, now let's move the situation on to slightly even more interesting, well, definitely even more interesting than what I've said so far, but some different things, it's equally interesting things about other principles of building a sukkah. So the Ramah says the following, Aval mutar la'asot sukkah tachat mechuba or bayit. You're allowed to build a sukkah. Just imagine this under a house. Imagine a scenario, you've got a big hanger. This is the scenario we're talking about, rather than just a sukkah roof. You're building your sukkah completely within a massive hanger, okay? Like a helicopter hanger. And then you remove that box which is above the sukkah. This is actually not a problem of Taseh V'lo Asuri, of making the sahach, rather than having it made automatically. Why? Because the pasul wasn't in the sahach itself. When you built it, it was all sort of kosher. You know, you sort of, other than you had an external problem of a big massive house sitting above you. But other than that problem, you'd built a sort of kosher sukkah. So when you remove the house above it, this was okay. Now, I think not everyone holds like this. Some would even say in such a scenario, from some of the shiurim I listen to, and I just emphasize it's a massive subject. So I'm really touching a thing. I remember when I did some research here, I normally get the principles of the shia, and then I look on YU Torah online. I look for some shiurim. And the first shia I looked at was a sort of quite a good one, 15, 20 minutes. And then I found another rabbi was speaking on the subject, and he gave us 14 series, a 14-part series. Each one was an hour. So, and I didn't listen to that, I hasten to add. But it is a massive subject. So there are different opinions here. But the basic principle here is when you build it under a big house, there's not a problem of Taseh V'lo Asuri, because the problem is only if you've got a pasul within the sahach itself. And here it was an external. Or the other view why it could be allowed is the action of removing the house is considered enough of action for this type of a pasul. That was the opinion. However, if you contrast it to source 12, which is ha'osa sukkah lamata b'bar tachat. Actually, let me take it from the Ramah because it's a bit clearer in the second line. V'chen mutar la'asot ha'sukkah tachat ha'gagot ha'suyot liftoch v'liskor. You're allowed to make a sukkah under roofs which are made to open or close. Umutar l'sagwa. So this is our those of you who, I don't have a sukkah roof, but those of you who've got the luxury sukkahs with sukkah roofs and things like that, and you're allowed to do that under that. That's good news. You're okay at this stage. You can even close them because of the rain, and you return and open them. There's no problem to open and close them even on Yom Tov if they've got hinges, because that's not a problem of binyan. There could be a situation, a thing which is designed to open and close isn't a problem of boner for Shabbat. If you look at the second last line, but this is the important point for our purposes. It's not a problem of taser v'lo masui. However, obviously, don't sit under them when they're closed. So according to the Shulchan Aruch, no problem. Again, you can build the sukkah. You can build your sukkah under, if you had a sort of literally, it was raining outside before Sukkot, and you had an indoor sukkah, you could build it indoors, and it wouldn't be a problem according to the Shulchan Aruch. However, the story doesn't end there. If you go to the Mishnah Berurah, he says there are problems with this. You can do it. Look at the second line. However, the Bach says he is strict on this. You need to open the doors of the roof before you put on the sachach. Etc. If you did do it, if you made it whilst your roof was closed, you need to open the roofs, you need to shake all the whole sachach. You have to lift everyone up and put it back down again. So basically, he would hold in the case where you've got your indoor sukkah or your sukkah with a roof, you can't make your sachach whilst the roof is on, because this would be a problem by opening up the roof. In this case, it's a problem of taser v'lo masui. So what's the difference between this case and the case above of the hanger? I'm getting very nervous at this point because I've just seen Rabbi Zobin's just joined. So anyway, so it's always very funny when people joining and leaving. It puts you off a bit. It's be good when we get back to the normal world where actually we can give sheer win without people joining and leaving. So anyway, at this point,
I'll make sure I don't leave, Adam.
Sure. Thank you. At this point, we've got why in the case here where the roofs are just above, was it a problem? But when it was in a massive hanger, it wasn't a problem. And maybe the problem is, I think, according to some opinions, is because when it's just above, that's sort of like posel sahach. It's sitting above, it's next to your sahach, it's all joined together. So the removing the posel sahach is like the equivalent of removing your plants which are tied to the ground and overhanging it. Therefore, it's a situation of taser v'lo masui. If the thing's way above, it's not connected to sahach, it's an external factor, and therefore it's okay. So that could be a rationale. Either way, best advice in all of these situations is to ensure, if you're building your sukkah, make sure you don't have the roof on. Make sure when you put your sahach on, you do it without the roof on, and you're not going to get into a problem, as according to all opinions of taser v'lo masui. If we move on to source 14, we're now going to go back to one of the earlier situations of the Godish, of the case of the haystacks. But the first thing in May, so this is good sort of to remember the very beginning of the Shia, the beginning of the halacha says here, Sukkah afapi shalom naset l'shem mitzvah kashera. Sukkah, even though it wasn't made for the purposes of the mitzvah, is kosher. That, of course, followed the opinion of Beit Hillel. Hu shetiyel asuyel itself, as long as it's made for shade purposes. So we said at the very beginning, if you build your sukkah in summer, in August, you've decided to build it for shade purposes, perfectly okay to then use that for Sukkot. Remember, we said, Yerushalmi, ideally you should do something new on that sukkah for the purpose of the Hag, like one tefach by one tefach, putting some new sahach on would be the best practice. Missing out the next line, and go to the third line. Actually the second line. Aval sukkah shenasit me'aleh, sukkah which is made by itself, pasula is posel, lefi, shalon nasit letzel. because it wasn't made for shade. Lefichach, therefore, our first example, our classical example of the Mishnah, the first one of Taseh v'lo asuri, achoted b'godish v'asar sukkah, ain't a sukkah. If you hollow out a haystack to make a sukkah, that's not a sukkah. Shari lo made godish zel itself, because the haystack wasn't standing for shade. Remember at the very beginning I said, if it's a block of haystacks, there's no shade for it to go on top of. Okay, and therefore you can't use it. However, if we go on, leficha, im asa, and this is mentioned later in the Gemara. I didn't quote the Gemara because it was easier to understand it here in the halacha. Leficha, im asa b'techila, kishanatan sham hagodish halal tefach b'meshach shiva, l'shem sukkah. If there was made initially, where we put there within the haystacks a gap of a tefach in a 7x7 l'shem sukkah. Okay, so this is the scenario. You've got a gap, an area of 1 tefach in depth. You put on top of that, and you have to do it in this order, it's very important. You put on top of that a haystack, which is 7x7. So that haystack is acting as a shade on your gap of 1 tefach. Why is it important, 1 tefach? I can say because I've just started the Mishnah of Oholot, not that I know that much about it, but the definition of when you have an area of 1 tefach, it has a halachic definition of a tent, an ohel, which is a space. It means if you have a dead body there or dead that can transmit tumah to anything else under the ohel. Okay, so it has a halachic status. So if you had this area of 1 tefach depth, and you put on top of it a 7x7 haystack, which is the minimum size for a sukkah, the hishlim al asara, and then you decided to dig into it and make it a full height of 10 tefachim. It was 1 tefach. The minimum size of a sukkah we know is 10 tefachim. So you shaharei nasid asachach shala kashera, that would be kosher. Shaharei nasid sachach shala letzel, because the sachach, its original sachach was shade. Okay, so if we go to if you flick over to the second last source, 16 explains it. Why would this be kosher in this situation? So hatam the kevan sheniach halal teva b'mesha shiva al shiva sheva shehu shior sika shem sachach alav. Since it has shem sachach alav, the kol teva makre ohel. So basically, you have, as I explained before, it's called a sachach. The name of sachach goes on the haystacks because that is a covering for your gap of 1 tefach. When you hollow it out afterwards, ein zeh asiyat hasachach ela tikkun hatafanot. This isn't the making of the sachach at all. This is actually just fixing the walls. And with the walls, we don't call that the principle of taseh v'lo min asuri. This is, I've said this all along. The whole point of taseh, making, you're talking about making the sachach. You've got a problem if in a situation where you're not making the sachach happens automatically. Here, what you're doing is you made the sachach perfectly well. When you stuck your haystack on top of the gap of the 1 tefach, that was making the sachach for shade. You had a technical problem. It was too small a sukkah. So what did you do? You dug into it and you made it 10 tefachim. It's very similar to the beginning of the Gemara in Sukkah. You have a situation where if a sukkah is more than 20 amot high, you're allowed to raise the floor. You can raise the floor in such a situation. So you could say, well, isn't that a problem also of taseh v'lo min asuri? It's not, because it's a technical problem. That bit on top was still acting as shade. By you bringing it up, you've rectified a problem, but not a problem within the sachach. Okay, and the final thing I want to say, if I could go back to source 14, there's an interesting Ramah, which is again a sort of word of warning for people making Sukkot. So it's good news because unless you made it incorrectly, I suppose you'd have to go, because we said you have to make it in Holomo, you'd have to go and make your Sukkah again tomorrow. But assuming you haven't done that, the Ramah says at the end, You can't make the sahach before you make the walls. The masah tefach samuch sahach mutter. So don't worry so much about the other bit, but that's the important one I want to emphasize. You can't make the sahach before you make the walls. And if you go to source 17, the last source, what's the problem? There's one opinion. The Bach says, maybe the other opinions, he says it is okay. However, many Acharonim disagree with him. They say even b'diavad is possible. Because here you've got potentially a situation here where you've gone and ended up, you've made your sahach, but it's not on top of anything. So it's not covering anything. It's sitting by itself, but there's no walls next to it, according to this problem. So this would be a classical problem of Taser V'lo Min Asui. Therefore, what you have to do is, of course, you have to make your walls first, and then you make your sahach. Where could you get into a problem on this? If you have a canvas sukkah like we do, and we obviously have to make it, that canvas sukkah is a problem potentially because it moves too much in the wind. So therefore you have to make your strings and various things around it, which are lavud, to make it into a proper sukkah. Now, if you ended up putting your sahach on top and subsequently doing your lavud strings all the way around, that will be a problem potentially of taser v'lo min asui. So let me just summarize before I complete with a few, if anyone's got any questions. We've said the principle of a sukkah, an argument between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel with an old sukkah. Essentially, Beit Hillel says an old sukkah is okay. Beit Shammai says it's not okay because it has to be made for Beit Shammai l'shem chag, for the purposes of Sukkot. Beit Hillel says you just have to make a sukkah for shade purposes. We discussed the 3 Mishnah in sukkah, which I've discussed the principles of taser v'lo min asui. You have to make a sukkah; it can't be made automatically. The principle of digging into a haystack was a problem. The idea of putting your bundles of straw on top of a sukkah when you've just done it for drying purposes and therefore changing your mind is no action, and draping your plants over the sukkah and then cutting them down, where there was an argument in Rav and Shmuel, is the cutting an action or not? And we've discussed various halachic ramifications. And just my final thoughts just on this as a sort of a closing comment. I've always found this subject very interesting in Taser V'lo Min Asui, because I think it's a reflection on us and on life, really. That, you know, in life, you can either be passive and you could just let life go by, or you can take positive action. You see what Rabbi Zobin, what Nair has done over the last few months. You know, they've gone into action. We've gone into action. It's been incredible, the services and what's been provided for the shul, etc. It's been a real case of Taser V'lo Min Asui. And I would say equally, and this is the thing, maybe I'll get into trouble with, but I'll say it anyway because I got the floor. So I don't think I will. But I think when it comes to learning as well, that often I think sometimes people, I think it's always better to be involved in active learning. That's what I'm saying. I'm a great believer. If you can learn yourself, believe me, I've learned so much more by giving this year than obviously you've listened to it, because I've had to prepare so much for it. But if you can be involved in active learning, if you can have your own chavurah to try and learn and understand things yourselves, as it's sort of, rather than just sort of, sometimes it's obviously good to listen to shiurim, but it always a preference in my mind is to be involved and try and learn things yourselves. The Torah is not just, maybe why I was asked to speak, or that I've just reflected on this, is we had 4 rabbis and a dayan and me, but maybe the Torah has not just been given to rabbonim and dayanim, the Torah has been given to all of us. All of us have the right, we can all learn, we can all improve. With that, I wish you all a Mo'adim L'Simcha, and if there's any final questions, I'm happy to take them, or Rabbi Zobin can answer them. Stunned into silence.
Shkoyach.
Thank you. Shkoyach, thank you very much, Adam. Very much appreciated. We'll have a few-minute break before Rabbi Zobin kicks off at 9 o'clock.
Shkoyach.